welcome to The Perspective with Mike Sherbino and Julie Stautland. Today, Pastor Joshua Broome and journalist Billy Hallowell are back on the show to talk about faith and culture and what can only be explained by recent events as the decline of the American empire. Is there a battle of bigger proportions going on? History shows us all empires decline, but it seems history is repeating itself time and again as tragedy after unspeakable tragedy emerges out of the U.S. Josh and Billy talk with Mike and Julie all things faith and culture and the impact shootings, wars, famines are having on our collective consciousness. Now is not the time to go inward, but to share the love of Jesus.
Well, welcome to The Perspective. So glad to have you with us today. I'm Julie Stautland and our host, Mike Sherbino.
Yeah,
yesterday you had a bit of a rough morning, so I wanted to ask...
A bit of a rough morning. It was terrible.
I want to know, was today any better?
Well, so far things are picking up. Okay? Literally I'm picking things up out of the garbage, off the floor. But I was thinking about what we define as a crisis.
Yes.
And we have the little things every day that come to test us. And I'm convinced the only way to be prepared for a crisis is beforehand. And sometimes whether it's the flat tire or the toast that lands upside down, that can just set you off. Because suddenly we're rushing, we got to stop, we got to clean up the mess.
The tone has changed.
The tone has changed. But that's our choice.
It is true.
How do you respond to crisis?
I wish I was fabulous at it. I think I'm getting better as I get more mature. But, I'm a feisty person, so I have this kind of knee-jerk reaction I have to overcome,
Okay. Well, we're going to talk about bigger crises today.
Yes,
and I'm glad you've joined us because we have Billy Hallowell and we have Josh Broome with us again today. And I'm looking forward to their help as we unpack what is going on between faith and culture. So we're trying to get our heads around what is happening with all the mass shootings. I think 10 in the last week as we go to record today. It's horrific. And how do we process that? What can we do apart from running and hiding? Stay with us. We'll be right back. Well, we're glad you're with us again today. And as we said in the beginning, we've got Billy Hallowell and Josh Broome are back on The Perspective. And Julie, one of the things I appreciate of both these guys is they're not afraid to talk about the issues.
Yes. Absolutely right.
And we've got issues, and I'm not even sure how we unpack it. So we're going to...
I know.
Let's just try. Let's do our best.
We'll do our best.
Billy and Josh, thank you for joining us. We're glad you're with us, and so good to have you. Tell me what's going on in your lives right now.
Yeah.
Well, not at this second, but in the last week or so. What are you dealing with?
On my end, it's busyness, just like a lot going on in the news cycle. And like you guys, I talk about a lot of the issues, deal with a lot of the issues and, balancing that with the craziness of life. But, really sort of heartbreaking issues, the school shootings we've seen and these horrible events that we've been covering. It's difficult.
How about you, Josh?
Yeah, I mean, my life's pretty chaotic, doing some cool stuff. And I'll be in D.C. advocating for some legislation that would potentially change the trajectory of my life and many others. So a lot of cool stuff going on.
Sounds very interesting.
Okay, well, seeing you've thrown that out to us, let's talk about the big question. There's some people that are saying we're actually seeing the decline of American society right now. What is it, as we've gone to tape today, 10 shootings, mass shootings in the last week, somewhere like 27 school shootings, in 2022. I get depressed with these statistics and over 246 mass shootings since January 1. What is that all about?
What is going on?
It's so complicated. I think, though, that the biggest thing that we have watched in American culture, and this is something that I've been tracking for years, you go back to the year 2000, okay, not that long ago, and you look at the public opinion polling on all sorts of different issues, whether it's marriage, whether it's, moral issues down the line, and you look at where the American public stood 22 years ago, where the American public stands now, and the erosion of values is so plain and so clear. And so that's the question, what is going on? And really, I mean, what has happened is you have an entire culture that has been lied to and been told there's no God, you're your own God, make your own rules. And when you go from a society that, of course, we've never been perfect. There's so many issues throughout the history of America, right? But when you go from this culture that embraces God and that seeks God, even culturally, to one that very rapidly and quickly doesn't believe there's anything eternal and that the self is the God, you start to see society unravel. And unfortunately, and I don't mean to oversimplify because I think that is the core issue, we are watching that happen at a rapid pace right now.
Well, I got a question to that, but before I do, Josh, give me your spin on it. What do you feel the same thing, or is it a little different?
I mean, I would say 100% yes, but even more so, I think specifically America as a westernized culture, we've gotten away from like having an independent dependency on Jesus, and we are a very a consumer heavy culture. So we have people who are sitting in churches waiting to be spoon fed their religion and their relationship with God. So they don't believe in biblical truth because they don't know biblical truth. And you can't lean on and depend on something that you don't truly know. So it's a sin issue at the end of the day, but it's not just, it's not either or. It's not pray or do something. It's pray and do something is the answer.
And I think that's a very critical point there. It's pray and do something. And that's something we spoke about the other day on the show, talking about Uvalde and the school shootings, and it's like prayer and thoughts, how that's nice, but thoughts really don't do anything. Prayer does. But when we add on prayer and action, then we're actually living it out. So that's a very good point you made there,
Okay,
Josh.
I'm going to be the opposition. What are we supposed to do? What can I do? What can you do?
Well,
Is
I
it
think
all
the
gun
thing.
control?
Well, I mean, here's the problem. Okay, when a mass shooting happens, and within 5 minutes, and I'm going to say this, and it's going to annoy some people, maybe.
Okay.
I think it's sinful for people to go, if you're a Christian, to go onto social media 3 minutes after a shooting has happened and to say, if we just had gun control, this wouldn't have happened. And it's sinful because you don't know any details about that shooting. You don't know how the person got the gun. You don't know anything about the assailant. And yet that's how society is approaching these events. Now, having said that, we have to have prayer and action. If there are actions, legal things that we can do that would help prevent these things, that don't impede people's rights and that don't punish law-abiding citizens, we should do those things. But that requires a conversation, right? That requires people to get in a room. And right now that's really tough in America. Democrats and Republicans are struggling to do that. And to sit down and not let an organization guide it, but to let principles and truth and facts guide that search for those things. So I'm not saying those don't exist, but to say immediately, like if we had just done this thing, this wouldn't have happened. At the end of the day, you have to dig into the fact that something in the heart of this 18-year-old kid in Uvalde made him think that it was okay to enter a school and kill 19 kids and 2 teachers. That is something you have to grapple with, because with or without the guns, and again, take appropriate measures if they exist, that existed in his heart, right? So that is our, when you talk about what do we have to do, we can do things to treat the symptoms, but the real problem is a spiritual one. And I just want to add what Josh said is so important, because I said, culture has moved away from God, but at the same time, the church has been completely ill prepared to train people in the church to not only hold on to the values, but to, evangelize others appropriately.
And I think you're making a good point there, for the fact that if we're just trimming the branches by dealing with gun control, we're not dealing with the roots, which is the fact, like you said, people are walking away from faith and what really changes hearts and changes communities and society in general.
Yeah, I mean, they're like, Cain didn't kill Abel because there wasn't legislating preventing him from using a rock. It's just true. It's like people do evil things because there is evil in their heart. But at the same time, absolutely, yes, there has to be healthy boundaries so that there's precautions that are taken. But again, it's not either or, it's both and.
Here's a quick question. Who are people blaming for most of these mass murders? In the past, we blame, whether it's society, we blame race, we can pull the race card. We can blame other things. We can just talk about, an addiction to social networks that feed all sorts of things, maybe war games are playing. What are you hearing?
It's interesting. I'm hearing the NRA. I mean, everybody wants to blame the NRA and they want to blame, loose laws and all that. But Franklin Graham actually had a really interesting post about this on Facebook, and he placed blame in an area that is not often talked about. And I think, again, we have to investigate it and explore it, but we do have some studies on it. And what he said was, look, everyone wants to ban guns. He was responding specifically to Biden talking about handguns, to President Biden speaking about that. But he said, we need to look at Hollywood. America glorifies violence. It's everywhere. It's in all of our entertainment. And there's a real unhealthy issue with that that's impacting people. And I have often thought, if we're immersing ourselves, it may be that the vast majority of people aren't going to change their perspective or become violent because they're watching these things. But maybe some people will. Maybe there's an impact, and maybe you become desensitized when you're so inundated. And by the way, the last 10 years, the violent content on television and movies has exploded. So I thought that was interesting. I mean, that was another area where there was some blame being placed.
Well, it seems to me that trying to change Hollywood would be a much harder challenge than the NRA. But you're listening to The Perspective. I'm going to be back, and Julie, in just a moment. We're going to talk more about faith and culture with Josh and Billy.
Sometimes just to unwind and keep it all together, I get in my truck and go for a drive. Sometimes I get on my motorcycle. We do all sorts of different things to try to keep ourselves together. We want to help you in your journey of life, to keep it together, to discover God's principles for living. All this month, I want to make available to you free of charge Dr. Grant Mullen's amazing book, Emotionally Free. It's a prescription for healing, body, soul, and spirit. I love this book. I recommend it to people. I want to give it to you. Write to us at theperspective.tv.
All right, we're jumping back into the conversation here. We didn't have a chance to give Josh time to speak on how Hollywood and violence, the combination, and how it affects faith and culture. So Josh, back to you. What's your word?
Yeah, I mean, just kind of to piggyback on what Billy was saying, the same way that our society is over-sexualized, and we see this played out in, rape culture and divorce rates, the same way, like, that's why porn's not a big deal. The same way that violence is perpetuated in an astronomical way. Like, for me, it's just so wild. My wife is an elementary school teacher, and instead of doing tornado drills or hurricane drills or anything like that, they're practicing what they would do if a gunman would come into their schoolroom and how she would protect her kids. And the fact that that's normal absolutely blows my mind.
Can I ask you this, since your wife is an elementary school teacher? I've heard the talk about, well, maybe we should arm the elementary school teachers. Now, how do you think your wife would feel about walking around packing with her, 6-year-olds or 7-year-olds?
Yeah, I mean, I think that she would be just fine with it, because at the end of the day, if there is an immediate threat, like, her objective is to protect the people that she's been entrusted with. So again, like, where would the gun be? How would it be safe? Regarding the children and all of that, like, it's worth a conversation. But if it's a real threat, and it is that someone could walk in that school and potentially take their lives, absolutely, yes, she would want to take the preventative measures that would be available to her, given her rights.
What do you
My
think
wife
about
is a
that,
teacher
Billy?
too. Well, my wife is a teacher
really?
too. Yeah.
Okay.
So it's interesting. Yeah. So my wife teaches in the South Bronx in New York City, and she's not a gun person. So for her, the idea of that is, terrifying, right? She wouldn't know what to do. But this conversation is an important one, because most of the teachers, and by the way, I want to say it's 28 states. I'm forgetting the exact number. A fair number of states in the U.S. allow school staff to carry in some capacity. And numerous states over the last week, there were 2 other states, Ohio and Louisiana, I believe, that brought forward legislation to allow school staff and teachers to carry. But this has to come with training and equipping.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
While my wife wouldn't feel comfortable, there are other teachers who would, right? And so you figure that out. And I have a friend who actually has participated in training teachers in Colorado in this, which is really interesting. So, I think it's controversial, but I actually think, look, the thing that people don't like to talk about here, and this is important from a practical and even a spiritual perspective, when somebody comes into a school and they commit, like what we saw in Uvalde, the only way you're stopping that person is with a gun. And so whether it's the police or it's somebody who's trained to do it in the school or somewhere else, communities have to figure out what they're comfortable with. But that is the only way you're stopping, unless the person stops themselves. And that's an uncomfortable reality in this circumstance.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, same. Like, my wife by no means is a gun person, but if given the opportunity, if it would have made sense for her to have that, I would like for her to have that option theoretically.
It's such a
we're gonna
delicate
take a different,
tension.
we're going to take a
Yeah.
different twist right now because obviously we can't solve this whole issue, but at least we're raising awareness to it. We see
Yeah.
this growing evil. I'm curious as we think about social media and all the different things, our culture and the cultural shift. Let's talk about morals and values. Let's talk about sexual morals. And we know how that's changed so much, even in the church, what is acceptable, what is not acceptable. And they're saying there's no absolutes. Do you see a connection between the decline in sexual morals and the upswing with this violence? How do they intersect? Is it all one and the same, or is it slightly different?
I would say if the word of God is not the inerrant, infallible truth in which you're depending on, then you have a scale of morality that is just swinging in the balance of your feelings. So either the word of God is the truth in which we stand on, that we create boundaries around, or there is no truth and we're back in the garden creating our own autonomy.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think that's so true. And when you exchange the idea that you are accountable to something higher, right? And this is why even cultural Christianity is not great, right? When it's in the culture, but it's better than having no Christianity whatsoever, having no influence. And I think that's what we're watching right now, because you become your own God. Everybody's saying my truth and your truth. But here's the interesting thing. Even though the majority of the country says that cultures can make up their own morality, their own truth, when you start to give the biblical perspective on things, suddenly it's not okay to have that culture. It's not okay to have those beliefs. And that's because people are really convicted on this. But yeah, we have divorced people from the truth. And so it affects sexuality. It affects everything across the board.
So let's turn the tables a little bit here and talk about the kids. Josh, what do you tell your children about what's going on in the schools in the U.S.? You know, how do you deal with this issue so that they're not living with fear and thinking about, yeah, I'm going to go to school today and play soccer and maybe get shot, you know?
Yeah, I was talking with Kristen Jensen, who is the CEO of Defend Young Minds, and she just has a brilliant way of just displaying the truth in a very an upfront way, but not, but not digging into the details, so that if you tell someone the truth, then they're prepared for what happens. But if you withhold the truth from them, now we're playing catch up. So I think we need to do a better job of, in a loving way, telling people the truth. So that's what we have to do to our kids. We have to tell them the truth so that they're prepared for the world, because the world is going to happen. They're going to be exposed to things. And if we relinquish being the first voice in their lives, then now we're playing with, well, what I'm saying is contradictory of what they've experienced. And now we're playing catch up. So we have to tell the truth first, and we have to just have those difficult conversations, because more often than not, it's not going to be negatively impactful for them. We just feel uncomfortable sharing it.
Well, I don't want to take us back down in the hole, but I want to ask a question that I think lingers in the minds of a lot of people who would profess to be followers of Jesus. And we've seen so many allegations against the Catholic Church, the Southern Baptists, and then so many big name preachers and leaders have been exposed to be something that they didn't profess to be. It's causing Christians to exodus the church. What are you saying to them to encourage them to come back? Or how can you coach us?
Yeah, I think, we have to stop putting our faith in people and in institutions. It's okay to be close with people and to have relationships with institutions and to be a part of an institution. But I think that what has really infected parts of the church has been really, there's the celebrity culture with pastors, and then there's sort of gentler versions of that. And what I mean by that is, putting your faith in the institution. I have personally never been a big fan of denominations, because I do believe, this is my belief, and yes, things can happen in small churches too, but that your first go-to as an institution is generally to protect the institution, right? If something happens, you're going to try to keep it quiet. You're going to try to make it go away. And that's what we see in these circumstances far too often. So my thing would be, we need to put our faith in Jesus. We need to remember that, we are going to be crushed and hurt if we put our faith in people, because they're going to let us down. But I also think we need to be diligent about making sure there's accountability within the structures that we are a part of, whether they are big or they are small. But I think that focus on Jesus if we keep our focus there when these things happen, hopefully our faith will not be rocked.
Well, that's a good place to land. We're going to stop there. We're running out of time, but we could talk forever. Thank you so much, Billy and Josh, for joining us. I know we'll have you back again. This has been very, very helpful.
Yeah, we're grateful. Come back soon.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Thanks for having us.
All right, stay with us, everyone. We'll be right back with Mike and the Word.
The global youth culture. More connected, but never more alone. Always seeking pleasure, but never satisfied. A worldwide suicide epidemic. Sexually broken and confused, raised on pornography, taught there is no absolute truth, only preference. How do we communicate the gospel to these young people who have such a negative view of God? How can we show them the love of Jesus in a language they'll understand? In Steiger, our heart is to bridge the gap between the church and the global youth culture. We do this by raising up missionaries and equipping the local church to proclaim the message of Jesus in a relevant way to culture today. Our vision is to establish 100 city teams by 2025, reaching 1 million global youth every year.
Well, as we grapple with this whole subject of not just the decline of what appears to be the decline of American culture, but also Canadian culture and in other places around the world, we struggle with how do we hold it all together? And we don't want to voice the question that, is this really happening? We're hoping that it'll just go away. And then we come back to the question, where is the power of God that we often hear quoted about or preached about in churches? How come I don't see his power in my life? How come it seems like evil is persisting in increasing measure? I want to take us today to Mark chapter 3, because you know, these questions are huge for us and they're all kind of interwoven, but I want to talk about healing and hecklers. Because what is desperately needed in the church today is to see the power of God revealed when we come face to face with the reality of who Jesus is. And I believe it was Billy Hallowell who was saying, just as we ended up the interview, that we need to be cognizant of the fact that we can't put our eyes on individuals. Yes, they will be accountable. The Bible says in James, don't let many of you be teachers, my brothers, because you're going to be held to a higher level. Don't lead people astray. Practice what you preach. That is one of the biggest concerns in my own life, is that I'll be consistent, that I will be faithful, that I will walk with God. But I want to encourage you today to put your eyes on Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith. And we come today where Jesus is dealing with a person whose hand is withered. I want to read the story to you. It said, he entered the synagogue, and there was a man there with a withered hand. This is Mark 3:1. And they watched Jesus to see whether he would heal him on the Sabbath. For those people, you didn't do any work on the Sabbath, and healing was considered work. They were so religious and yet so far from God. And he said to the man with the withered hand, come here. And he said to them, to the people looking, is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do harm, to save life or to kill? But they were silent because they knew if they said the wrong thing, they would condemn themselves. And he looked around at them with anger, grieved at their hardness of heart. And he said to the man, stretch out your hand. He stretched it out, and his hand was restored. What an incredible, powerful story. I think one of the things the story causes me to think about are some specific questions. One was, why was this person healed and the other person wasn't? We can always find examples where God didn't seem to answer my prayer the way that I wanted. Sometimes people wonder, is God punishing them because of sin, or is there something wrong in their life? And then another thing is, do I not have enough faith? Should I be praying differently? And I know everything will be well when I get to heaven, but what about here on earth? I know that in one level, I really struggle with the fact that my neighbor in one of the places where we have a small campsite, a trailer, he was afflicted with a life-altering stroke. And I'm saying, God, why is this happening? And the Lord reminded me that there are times when he doesn't give us the answer, but he calls us to trust. So here are some observations I have made as a pastor with regards to the whole ministry of healing. I've seen people manipulated by spiritual leaders when it's implied that if they believed more or gave more or trusted more, they would have all that God wanted them to have. Watch out for that. Don't fall prey to that. I've also seen where it has been said that if it only speak the word in faith, the person would have been healed. Name it and claim it. You know, blab it and grab it, confess it, possess it, and shout till the glory comes out. It's kind of one of the slogans. I remember taking part in a service for a dear friend who had battled cancer and died. And then the other preacher got up and he said, Les didn't have to die, but he chose to die. We know he's with the Lord, but basically he was implying if he'd had more faith, he would have been healed. That really messes with people's minds. So where do I come to in this? I have come in my own journey, and I want to say this in the context that many of you are writing in for prayer. And there are times when we see God answer our prayers immediately. Sometimes there's a delay. And sometimes, yes, we have to wait until we get to heaven. As the Lord reminded me the other day, sometimes you don't know why, but will you trust me? But I've learned this, that when I started to pray for more people, I saw more people healed and more people made well. And I'm still excited about the prospect of praying for people. There's not a day goes by that I don't run into one or two people that are desperate, wanting prayer. And I want to invite you today that in the midst of this cultural demise, to experience the power of God in your life, to know that He loves you, that He cares for you, He knows what you are going through right now. And don't let the enemy belittle you that it's your lack of faith, but look to the Lord and say, Lord, I want to thank you for all that you are giving to me. I ask in the name of Jesus for your healing and your restoration. And that's how I pray for myself, and that's how I pray for other people. I pray with confidence that God knows better than I and that He will hear and answer prayer. And when that happens, when we call on God, His power is released. And I believe as individuals, we need to be praying about our nation, the nation to the south of us, for this unparalleled surge of evil that we're seeing. That people will hear and hunger to know the Lord and to know that in Scripture, we have absolutes that we can follow that will keep us until the day we're in the presence of Jesus.
You know, the idea of free choice keeps coming back to my mind, that we're all given free choice. We can do what we want with what we want. But we never really think about where's that taking us and what other influences are we allowing in when we use our free choice. And many times it takes us down a path we don't want to go, and we reap those negative consequences individually and as a society. And yet God's always there saying, if you come back to me, I'll show you a different way, and you don't have to keep living with those negative effects of your free choices.
You know, it's interesting, Joshua, who was a great leader of the Israelites, at the end of his life, he looked at all the people and he said, you need to choose this day who you're going to serve. But as for me and my house, we are going to serve the Lord. And folks, if I could just talk to you today, all of us, as Julie has been saying, have to make a choice. And to choose to say no to Jesus is a choice. To say, I'm going to do it on my own is your choice. But at the end of the road, who are you going to be trusting in? And I know why I trust in Jesus. There have been difficult moments, but there's also been wonderful moments. I know that if you choose Him, He will never fail you or forsake you. He will be with you.